Welcome back to our Build and Learn series. Today is part 2 of our industry build. I had to divide these episodes into 2 parts because I felt like that was the best way to cover just the volume of things I wanted to do in this industrial portion of our city. I also want to say thank you if you've been keeping up with the series and if you checked out my Cities 2 Early Access gameplay video. I really appreciate all the kind comments and all the support, and welcome on board to anybody that has just subscribed since that video released. But if you are new to the series or the channel, be sure to hit the subscribe button, leave a like, drop a comment down below with your thoughts on the episode. Be sure to check the community tab for polls and other information regarding the series. And furthermore, if you didn't know, I do stream on Twitch, and a couple days a week we tend to dabble with City Skylines. Not to mention, we also have a Patreon if you'd like to support myself or the channel further. All those links are available in the description below if you'd like to check them out. But for now, let's dive into our industry build part 2. If you're watching our previous episode, this is pretty much where we left off. We've got one side rather established where the other side appears pretty empty, and largely what's in place is stuff having to do with water filtration, power, trash, mainly utilities or services. Our focus is really going to be on the right side of this main avenue, and we're going to be primarily looking at how to add some generic industry as well as industry's DLC components to our industrial park. Some of you may be wondering, how do I decide between what I'm going to be utilizing? Well, as I mentioned in the last episode, I've become more and more accustomed to using industry's DLC to really expand industry areas. There's so many unique buildings that you can put in those spaces to fill the area to make it appear dense, and then you can also create pockets of industry if you just want to do multiple industrial parks. I'll also use generic industry to help fill the area up, along with anything I can find in the workshop, typically like warehouses and stuff like that, to give the industrial vibe, while also continuing to find ways of filling space. Ultimately, I want a lot of buildings. I want a lot of buildings to take surface area, as well as a bunch of smokestacks and things like that. I want a stark contrast between this area and other parts of the city. If this is juxtaposed against something of like a residential base or your downtown, it should look different. So again, surface area is important. I want to spread buildings out. I want to have large factories. I want to have warehouses, but I also want to have those smokestacks. I want to create little areas of pollution so it looks different from your downtown or your really modern sort of midtown area that we've already established in our city. These areas I typically lean on being very heavy with concrete, some trees, a lot of dirt, stuff like that. I want it to look worn and, kind of torn up a little bit, like it's been aged a while, right? And then with some of the outskirt areas, I'm going to incorporate things like logging, because I feel like that's when you can start to spread buildings out and kind of fade into the forest surrounding the industrial area. Not to mention, you've already seen in the previous episode, we talked a little bit about our cargo station. We're going to try to incorporate that a little bit more. The train lines are pretty important for this part of town, so you're going to see how I expand upon what's here already to make it seem like it's a more valued aspect of our industrial park. I think the biggest thing I need to keep in mind at some point is I'm probably going to have to make some sort of like overpass to connect it to the other side of the city as this area continues to expand. I haven't decided quite how to do that. I think I know some areas where I can, but ultimately, like, this needs to be connected in a different way that's not reliant on just the interchanges off the highway. Just like I've talked about in the previous episode, I'm going to focus primarily on importing a lot of our goods that we need to manufacture. I'm also going to focus on having unique factories continue to produce materials in the city, but ultimately this is just a preference. You can obviously set up all of your industrial DLC pipeline in your city if you choose so. I just like to import some of the stuff. It kind of makes it a little bit easier to build out the industrial park the way I prefer. Now, a little bit off topic is just really kind of taking in the growth that the city has made in this series. And I'm pretty pleased with some of the expansion we've had in the industrial area, along with some of the areas in downtown. I was nervous when I started the city because I know that I planned the downtown to be a little bit smaller, but it came out way bigger than I expected. So I still have a lot of work to do there in integrating it with the rest of the city. And I think one big area that'll help it out a ton is the space between this industrial park and the downtown itself. I'm not sure what all sort of projects we can get into in that area, but I do think I need to start focusing on it and try to come up with some ideas, because that would make this whole city feel a little bit more cohesive. Right now it's a little bit spread out because, like I've talked about, we're kind of working in different sectors, different projects. So if you have suggestions for some things you think we should add, obviously throw it in the comments down below. But ultimately, there's plenty more to do. And I think one area we're going to feature in the next episode is probably going to be the port, because that's something I want to add. It's something I want to incorporate. So it's going to be a little bit more of an industrial episode, but there may be ways to kind of help blend it into some of the areas we've set up, and then have a more, I guess, focused point of like, okay, this is the area where I want to focus on next, so that all this that we've done in the first several episodes and what we've done in the last couple episodes begin to merge together. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the direction I want to go with some of the future episodes. And it's just really about, developing the city, continuing to create sort of cohesion between all the different elements we've been working on, and starting to see this area like really turn into what we had hoped it would be. Something really cool about when I zoomed out though is I feel like we have our coastline area on one end and we have our industrial area bookending the other side. So we have an area or a space to work within, which I think will be really fulfilling once we start to fill out those areas, because then it's going to feel a little more complete. And I'm excited to see sort of where we land with the city as we progress. Like, I don't know how many episodes this series is meant to be. I didn't really have a plan beyond, starting the series and getting to Cities 2 and then sort of reevaluating how much more time we wanted to spend here. It seems like many of you enjoy the series and want to see it, continue, and that might be something that I take into consideration and still try to output episodes attached to, the Build and Learn series in Cities 1, because obviously people are still going to be playing this. To better develop our train setup here, I added some of these cargo warehouses, right? So they rely on the train line to keep their stock balanced, and that kind of makes a little bit more density around my train lines. But in addition to that, I want to add something else to our cargo station to make it seem a little bit more complex and not so just, limited in terms of what all it has. Now, given that's a vanilla asset, I'm sure there's ways to do it. And one way that I tend to lean on is these sort of cargo warehouses. They're basically containers that act as warehouses, and I think they actually fill and will empty depending on their situation. But these tend to add a really, really helpful level of detail to your cargo station. Now, obviously the cargo containers on the vanilla side don't look quite as good as these, but at least you get something else there and they function. In addition to just using them around cargo stations for trains, you can also use them around cargo stations for ships. So what's really neat about these is, like I said, they're functional like a warehouse, but I think what's also cool is you can use them in a variety of situations. If you just want some sort of cargo yard, you could do that. If you want to expand upon what's already established and maybe some of your vanilla assets like your cargo station, you can do it there. They have a lot of purpose, and I think that's really, really helpful. I mean, granted, you could probably attach it to some of your factories if you wanted to too. Like, as in you might want sort of a cargo yard that maybe is used for some of the resources at a factory. I realize detailing is often considered sort of adding trees, bushes, and kind of like doing a lot of the vegetation side of city skylines. Keep in mind that there are these like functional buildings that you can add. I mean, to a degree, detailing isn't limited to just vegetation or to props. It can also be buildings that, help give sort of a realistic look, for example, or expand upon maybe vanilla buildings or base buildings to give it more depth. And I think that is also sort of factored in detailing. I don't want to think that it's just, oh, I'm going to add trees and that is my detailing effort, right? It goes way beyond that. Detailing gives cities a lot of personality. So whenever you can find things to add and create variety or create that personality, something specific to the area that you're building, I think it's pretty significant. So if you do have access to the Steam Workshop or you're looking through Industries DLC, there's these buildings and components that you can add that are far beyond just vegetation, far beyond just a tree, that may help give you a little bit of variety in that space or continue to develop and add to what's there on a vanilla base game level. And I think that also should be factored into your ideas of detailing. So something I mentioned earlier was that I'll use like Forestry, for example, to help kind of like transition from some of the denser areas of your industry, park or area into forestry, because then you can kind of fade out using trees. Now you can also go in and do probably something similar with farms, because as you may know, you do also have the ability to turn some of your farmland or whatever into like greenhouses, which can create buildings, and then you can have, some trees and then slowly fade into just the forest of the city. I tend to think that the farms don't always look quite the way I want. They're just not big enough typically. There's been some assets I've, leaned on from the workshop, and I may have to dig in there if I want to add farms here. But for now, we're going to use Forestry to help create a fade from our industrial area into this forest by the lake. Now, all it's really meant to do is give us something besides concrete, right? And we're going to spread the buildings out a little bit, and we're just going to place them behind this factory. And then hopefully it'll feel like a little bit more natural to go from that into just trees versus having like a factory and then, nothing. Something you've heard me recommend in the past has been to utilize the mod BOB to help go in and change out some of your trees that are attached to buildings or some of your props. And this is really helpful for some of your industries DLC, because if you want it to look, closer to what's already in your city, you can do that by, replacing trees and making some adjustments there. And then all of a sudden you have a little bit more cohesion between what you're building and some of the vanilla trees that come stock with some of these buildings. With just this industrial park, we've been able to incorporate almost every industry or a part of every industry with the exception of farming, which is pretty cool. And it gives us a variety of materials to use in some of our unique factories, which, keep in mind, you could also spread those out. And something I may do is lean on either duplicating some of those unique factories in our port area just to give that a little bit more density, or saving some for that space. I'm not really going to be as pushy with, fishing and stuff like that in the area, although I may use some of the assets. I don't know that that's something that I feel like tends to look as good as I want. So I'm going to lean on some of those assets over there, and I may save some unique factories to incorporate on that side of town, which isn't going to be far. It's probably going to be near our water pumping station in that general area. So there's plenty of industry that's going to be incorporated in the city in different ways. Like I said, we've got all of these different specialties incorporated. We're going to have a port added, and then we'll be pretty set for a while. I think that's going to give us plenty of room to expand our city in terms of residential to get people in here, and there will be jobs available. Which kind of reminds me, I do need to start working on some sort of education system for the city, which may be coming up in the near future. I do want to work on some North American type like high schools, elementary schools, and then eventually get to a college at some point. We'll need to kind of plan that, I guess, and figure out where that's going to go. Something you may also notice that I do is I tend to incorporate more than one facility of any type. I may have multiple warehouses, more warehouses than I need, but all of that is more an aesthetic thing than it is like something that's super purposeful. And this is again to build up the area of an industry to look and feel and kind of operate to scale that I want. Like I don't want it to feel super small compared to downtown, right? Everything should have some sort of balance. So that's kind of why I use multiple buildings and duplicate buildings, and I try to incorporate them in a way that they don't look super repetitive, like shifting them, placing them at different angles and stuff like that, or I might merge them. And all of that again is just to continue to add density to this area. But being able to store some of those goods that you make in warehouses, especially if you're producing like a surplus, can also continue to give you the option of placing more factories elsewhere. So you can make smaller industrial parks in different parts of your city so that you can, kind of spread out some of the traffic. And then you have trucks kind of driving from one side of the town to the other side of the town. It's kind of a way to, I guess, create realism in terms of how things operate within the city, if that makes sense. So that's something that you can play with too. Like I've done cities where I'll have a lot of the sort of processing plants and things that you need to create certain goods on one side with a couple factories, but then I'll, have a couple warehouses and a factory on the other side of town. So there's some traffic in between those areas. As you can tell, this area is starting to look dense and it's starting to look very populated, not only with buildings, but traffic. And, supplies and goods are moving from one area to another area. And that's exactly what I want. Now, I think we are going to have to address some traffic things probably in another episode, but I do think this is a good foundation for our industry. And largely what I'm going to be doing around this between the highway and the industry itself is just adding trees. I like it when highways and networks like that have trees around them, some sort of barrier. You don't obviously need to worry about that as much for like your industry. You could also do like open lots or, old buildings if you have that in your inventory to sort of create like abandoned areas, which are really cool, especially close to industry areas like some old factory buildings. So something I mentioned earlier was to start placing factories outside of this area. So I'm going to go ahead and place one unique factory away from the town and trying to figure out where that's going to go. But I do think near our water treatment facility is probably where we're going to expand some of our port area. So I kind of want this side of town between downtown and the industry to appear a little bit more closely tied to the industry, right? It's not going to be our fancier side of town. I think we have that established more along the coastline. So you can reuse some of the factories you've already used or save a couple for different areas. Again, creating those industrial parks away from the main area totally works. Now, you could also incorporate different types of housing near these type of areas. Like we could incorporate some lower income housing or something like that, which we'd probably lean on the theme workshop for. That might be another option to incorporate. And something else that I do is like when I set up a port, I use a lot of the warehouse fuel tanks and then a couple of unique factories that have like a lot of smokestacks and stuff like that. Just to kind of create like a little bit of density behind the port areas, like, especially if there's gonna be like a shipbuilding facility or something along those lines. I think a lot of that always goes back to planning your city and sort of what all you want. Like if you know you're going to build a port, you may want to reserve certain buildings for that area. If you know you want a specific type of industry somewhere, you may want to look for that place and reserve certain buildings for there. So keep that in mind as you're planning. It's helpful to sort of figure these things out so that you don't get stuck, because sometimes expanding, especially at sort of a more rapid pace, you may land on situations where you're trying to determine what should be there. And sometimes we'll just throw stuff in, like it's easy to do that with something like generic industry as well, when you have such great assets in the library of industries DLC. But having that plan and always going back to sort of the purpose of the city can, again, help you define these areas and figure out things relatively quickly, right? What makes sense in the space that you're building. And something I haven't done a lot of in the city, because I'm taking a very modern approach to a lot of the building selection, especially with downtown and how we've done some of the coastline. but you can always try to incorporate the sort of progression of the city, like having older factories in certain areas or abandoned buildings to show that the city's been there a while. And that's not really something I've been doing very well with the city. But again, I'm using less assets than maybe I did in the past, where in the past I'd have a ton of old factory buildings and old commercial buildings. And I haven't really dove into that yet, at least not for this build. I want to keep it somewhat accessible so you guys can look through the list and find certain buildings and incorporate them into your own builds if you choose. But that is something you could consider, is like the progression of your city going from what it was, 50 years ago to what it is now, or something along those lines. I think separating your city from other cities that you build or just other cities that you see, just finding ways to incorporate personality, which you can do through detailing, which you can do through the building selection. And I think that that's something you all should dive into, right? When you're starting a new city or when you're in the process of building, just try to find ways of incorporating different things that, once again, always give your city a certain personality, a certain distinction from other cities. And that's not to say one city is better than another. It's just you want personality, and that is how your city is really going to start to come to life and be different from everything else that you may see or what you're creating, when you're doing cities back to back. Plus, it can breathe a little bit of life into the build itself. When you start to follow the same template every time, it doesn't always, prevent yourself from sort of getting burned out. You got to kind of mix it up and find a new challenge. And I realized today's episode has been primarily a little bit more chatty. Like, I'm trying to find opportunities to communicate more general ideas at times versus I'm putting this building here or doing this. And I hope you guys don't mind that. I'm trying to lean more into this almost podcast vibe on some of these episodes, so it doesn't feel as strictly educational. I want to also have some diversity and sort of the messaging and what we're talking about and what we're doing to give you guys other ideas and hopefully inspire some creativity in certain things that you're working on. And of course, I want to make these episodes as approachable as possible, but also make sure they have a little bit of my own personality incorporated. Sometimes they get I feel a little bit robotic in terms of how I'm breaking things down or how I'm talking about things. So I do want to try to find ways of having more casual conversations embedded in these videos. I'm just not very good at sometimes incorporating them very well. So like I just mentioned, it's fine to incorporate buildings that maybe show a passage of time. So I'm going to use this space here as sort of a lot. I'm not going to go into extensive heavy detailing, and in fact there's probably some props and things that I need to incorporate later, but for now we're going to set up this lot. I'm going to use some surface painter to create a little bit of texture on the ground that is different, being the dirt or ruin texture, and then a few decals to help make this look like a lot that maybe has seen some construction equipment but nothing's really been done about it. It's just kind of sitting here, so you could argue that it's probably for sale. We've got some office buildings next to it, which is something else you can incorporate these spaces. If you find, that you have a bunch of factories, they should have offices nearby, right? Where folks go and work near the industrial area. Maybe these are sort of the control areas for a lot of the factories in this region. So you can have open lots, abandoned lots, old factory buildings that, have since been abandoned or are falling apart if you can find the assets for it. You can incorporate commercial and office buildings to help you establish something different besides just industry. I mean, gas stations are an easy add that you can make to this area just to continue to populate it with buildings. Maybe an old restaurant, an old bar, a couple beat up stores, a laundromat, stuff like that maybe has some wear and tear applied to it. Stuff that you're not really necessarily going to put on the coastline, but you do want to incorporate it into your spaces in the city that are a little bit more torn up. To create abandoned lots, you're obviously going to need to lean on props and decals and things to sort of create the vibe that you want to make it appear abandoned in the first place or worn out. And that's something I have a very limited amount on. I've done, plenty more in areas like this with more assets. I do have a video on overgrowth, for example, to kind of show you ways of layering grass and other textures on the ground for vegetation to get a sense of something being, not as well kept. And I do this from city to city. I usually have that one area or a couple areas that are just not as well kept up, that have been left there and just aren't maintained. And I think that's, again, it's a personality thing for your city. So we're going to use a limited amount of assets, but you can already see this sets itself apart from what we have elsewhere. And then, of course, adding some trees in this area to create a little bit more visual density is nice. And we have a lot here. And again, it's very minimally detailed, but it still gives you the impression that we're looking for. Unfortunately, though, I don't have much construction equipment to throw in here. That is probably the main thing that I'm missing. It would be cool to have, a couple of tractors or something like that in this space. But for now, we'll keep it pretty simple. And I may come back to this and start adding more as we get into a little bit more detailing on the city at some point. But you can always use some different props and things and really kind of get creative with what you're trying to set up in the area just to make it fit whatever look you're going for. While assets and things that you pull from the workshop may be dependent on hardware, it's always helpful to find multi-purpose things that you can utilize. So I really love the clusters of vegetation that I have that come in like bushes and sort of weeds, and you can use those in multiple areas. Like some of them can be fine for creating overgrowth or just helping show an area that isn't kept up, but it also can be used in certain situations where you want sort of wild flowers in a spot, maybe in a planter near the beach, or we've used those in some spots along the coastline to create some like barrier between a lot of our infrastructure, our roads, and the sand of the beach. Something you can add to that list is also like the networks of weeds and grass that I found that I've used in a couple of the episodes previous to this one, where I've been able to fill in some space with a little bit of texture. So adding those sorts of things can be really helpful in your library, as long as you can find how they can be used in multiple different spaces, or just how often they can be used, instead of using a ton of different grass elements and pieces that can tend to bog down your game. So I'm going to go ahead and speed up into a time lapse of the build, and largely what you're going to see me do is just sort of fill dead space. We'll be using parking lots and some other buildings like generic industry primarily, just to help fill out some of the areas we've left open. Not to mention plenty of trees to start fading out the industry area and kind of finalizing this space. The industrial park in its entirety has come out a lot better than I thought. I wasn't sure how this was really going to fit in, but it seems to fit this area well, and it seems to be of the size that I want. And I can imagine adding a port nearby will help fill out the town nicely. But this, in addition to the port, will really kind of give us a very dense industrial area that I think will set a good balance between this side of town and the more residential and downtown area. Again, you want to strike a balance and you want to make things sort of scaled properly, and I'm trying to do that with what I'm incorporating here. And for those of you that still want to lean on the simulation aspect of the game, keep in mind that this is all still management stuff. Like, all this is functional. This isn't something that I've placed just for the aesthetic, which I do pretty often, but this area is functional, and it's not just for the aesthetic. It's going to operate and it's going to send traffic here, and we're going to have jobs because of it. So with that said, I hope you guys enjoyed the episode. I know the commentary may be a little different. Let me know what you think. If you feel like I need to lean more into sort of the educational side or something along those lines, I would appreciate it. Be sure to hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Let me know your thoughts on the episode. Hit the like button, and I'll see you next time.